Welcome to Ground Truth. Join Sam Faddis as he looks for truth from those on the ground, in the middle of the action with key insights regarding critical national and international issues. Listen for discussions and interviews on national security, terrorism, politics, espionage, the paranormal, and weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome, I'm Sam Faddis. This is WKCV, the voice of Keystone College, 103.5 FM in kind of gray and about to be drizzly La Plume, Pennsylvania. Today we're going to be talking about politics, specifically about Pennsylvania and 2020 elections. And this is one of at least a couple of shows we're going to do on this. Today we're going to be talking with a representative here from the Democratic Party and looking at things from that perspective. I will say up front, I don't have any pretense of being objective in this. I'm a registered Republican. I've run for office for Congress as a Republican. But the point of the show is not for me to sit here and lay out my opinions. It's to illuminate the issues and get a perspective. And then we're going to trust to the voters to make up their own minds about which way they think we should go. So with no further ado, with us today we have Austen Miller from the Wayne County Democratic Party, Democratic Committee. Austen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, Austen, I mean, again, I've laid out, my position. I don't claim to be objective, but I don't really think that's what the Founding Fathers had in mind, that we were all going to always be on the same wavelength. They had this crazy idea that if we actually talked about things and had free speech, that the voters could figure out which way they wanted to go, and frankly, probably that direction would be different at different points in time. So, I said we're talking Pennsylvania 2020 primary focus presidential election. Doesn't mean exclusively. The conventional wisdom certainly is that in 2016, Pennsylvania was key to Donald Trump's victory. And certainly from a Republican perspective, they regard Pennsylvania as being crucial going forward for 2020. What's the Democratic take on that, the importance of Pennsylvania?
I'd say from the Democratic perspective, Pennsylvania is by far the most important state for the 2020 election. We have to win back the working class voters, unions that historically are Democrats but voted for Donald Trump, and we need to have a candidate that can win those back.
So it's interesting you throw that out. My family on my dad's side is all from the southwestern part of the state, Greene County, literally the southwestern corner of the state. And my grandfather was, in fact, a congressman from that area back in the 30s and 40s. And he was a Democratic congressman. And I think often about the fact, he's passed away a number of years ago, that he would be very unlikely to be a registered Democrat today, given he was very much a working man's guy. He was part of the New Deal Democratic majority that took control of Congress. I think there are ways in which he would think the party has moved in a different direction. So back to your comments, working people, working men, working women, unions, factory workers, etc. How does the Democratic Party do that? How do they win those folks back?
Well, the first thing is really focusing on the economy. I think they have to stay away from some of these social justice issues that in 2016 I think they got a little too much into. Like James Carville once said, it's the economy, stupid. Right. And Democrats really have to focus on the economy, talk about, dinner table issues, the economy, healthcare, education. And I think you'll see those voters come back. I think there was a lot of them that were apprehensive towards voting for Hillary Clinton and wanted a change and voted for Donald Trump because of that. But going forward, I think someone like Joe Biden has the opportunity to be able to win a good enough amount of those voters to win Pennsylvania and the rest of the Midwest to be able to win the White House.
So I don't want to put you too much on the spot here because I know you're here speaking for the party as a whole, really, and you guys are very much still in the middle of a primary. There's not much of a primary going on the Republican side. I mean, there are other candidates out there, but I don't think anybody seriously thinks, unless Trump is really removed from office, I don't think there's much question about who's running.
Yeah, it'll be Donald Trump.
But on the Democratic side, clearly there's a very large field, and the primary process is not a long way from over, so we don't know who's going to be selected. But when you talk about Joe Biden, that's a guy that I can see in union halls in Pennsylvania where he's already been, actually, pretty extensively, with his sleeves rolled up, talking to people in very old school Democratic jargon. And I don't mean that to sound pejorative. That's not what I'm going. there are a lot of other candidates on the stage, and I've watched all the debates, who seem to have moved considerably further left. Again, that's my spin. That doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I don't think that's controversial to say that they've moved to the left.
So, I mean, how does that play? Does that help the Democratic Party, hurt the Democratic Party?
I think it depends, because when you talk about like economic issues, people want to see these big changes happen. That's why a lot of Bernie Sanders voters in the primary in 2016 went on to vote for Donald Trump. But they also have to stay away from some of these really just strange positions, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have announced they're for criminals in jail who are currently imprisoned being able to vote. Stuff like that's not going to win back voters that we need to, and it's not an issue that people are really worried about. That's not going to bring about the change that people want to see.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up, because that strikes me, again, personal opinion, as the definition of the kind of thing that on the other side of the aisle in the Trump campaign, that when somebody says that, they're already filming the campaign video for the general election in which Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders advocates convicted felons voting, and you can just see that thing playing 150,000 times in the course of a week, over and over and over.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like I'm sure the Democratic Party has lots of clips of Donald Trump saying something at a press conference that will be played 150,000 times.
Yeah, I'm sure. I get one of those each week.
Probably, maybe every day. I don't know. Probably could be. So you're looking at Pennsylvania, and I lived in Pennsylvania years ago. I moved back in the state relatively recently. But to my understanding, in terms of center of gravity when it comes to population, in a place like Pennsylvania, you're talking Philly, Pittsburgh, some other major cities, and you're talking the suburbs around them. What's the Democratic strategy for winning those areas?
Well, you have to really run up the numbers in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, those urban areas, especially with minority voters. You have to be able to win in the urban areas in large numbers, especially with minorities. You have to be able to reach out to the suburbs, get more of those voters than we did in 2016, because Democrats did underperform there. And then also in more rural areas like Scranton, working class, again, union voters, be able to get them back to the party, because that just didn't happen in 2016. Scranton went for Donald Trump, and that's something that historically shouldn't happen when you're the Democrats.
So you used a phrase there, run up the numbers, and I understand what you're talking about, I think, but just to make sure that the listeners are focused on this, I mean, you focus on people voting in numbers of, votes for Trump, votes for whoever's going to run against him. But there's the issue of people that turn out and vote and who they vote for. And then there is the separate but related issue of whether people vote at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, you will hear certainly Republicans in the state of Pennsylvania talking about relatively rural counties like Susquehanna or Bradford. And they will say, even though this population is much smaller, they will say we have to run up the numbers, meaning it's not good enough that we win the county. We got to, when you're counting up all the votes statewide, every place we have an advantage, we got to make sure you show up. That's what you're talking.
Win big.
You can't just say, yeah, we already won, I'm staying home, because it's not just about winning your precinct or winning your county. It's about where we end up overall. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, luckily, the one upside to having a country as divided as we are right now is I believe a lot of people are going to turn out and vote. Especially Democrats are energized. A lot of the Republicans are energized. So I think we're going to have a high turnout compared to recent elections.
So you mentioned earlier you were talking about the economy. And it seems to me historically that the economy is typically the number one issue in most elections. I mean, sometimes we're in the middle of a war, something else. But typically people vote kitchen table, pocketbook issues, and the question is dissatisfaction with the economy. I don't have a job, or I have a job but it pays half of what my old job paid. So I'm envisioning that, in a couple of weeks when we're talking to your Republican counterpart that we're going to get on here and we get to this point in the show, that person is then going to just be beating the drum like, well, that's great. I'm glad. I agree. Lowest unemployment rates in the African American community in history, Hispanic community. Almost all jobs now, new jobs created, are going to minority workers, yada, yada. I mean, I'm going to anticipate this refrain. If we're coming down to the economy, What is it about the economy that you think is going to benefit the Democratic Party?
Well, I think people see these numbers, the stock market booming and unemployment low, but everyday Americans aren't feeling that change for the most part. You talk about productivity. From World War II until the 70s, productivity and salaries, when one went up, the other went up. Since the 70s, that hasn't happened. Productivity's almost doubled since the 70s, and salaries gone up like 8%. I think the number is something roughly in that figure. There's such a disparity between what the economy's numbers say and how people are feeling. When people see the stock market, booming, a lot of people aren't involved in the stock market. They don't have money invested in that. And a lot of people are still anxious about that after the collapse in 2008 and 2009, that they don't want to put money into the stock market. They don't have that trust yet. They don't have that confidence.
Right. Well, there is, I don't remember the exact numbers on this, but an interesting point, for instance, we've talked a couple of times, we've sort of touched on minority communities or specifically African-American communities. And I think there's some pretty conclusive literature out there that, if you look at average white households, just to use that blanket term, versus African-American households, the actual amount of household wealth, there's a massive, massive disparity. I mean, just the average family in terms of, even if they don't feel like they've got much money, a white family that has equity in their house and money in a bank account and stuff like that. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about. I mean, in other words, it's great that we got jobs, but it's still not translating into much down to the ground level.
There's still a lot of anxiety in everyday people about, how are they going to be able to put food on the table? How are they going to pay for health care? What happens if someone in their family gets sick? Those are all big things that need to be addressed still.
Okay, so again, I'm anticipating, I don't want to end up in the mode now of speaking for my Republican brethren who will say something totally different in a couple of weeks when we have them on the show. But I'm anticipating that they're going to say, okay, well, that's what Trump's gig is, man. He's fixing the trade imbalance and he's building jobs, and the whole deal is stick with the program and we're going to all, the rising tide lifts all boats, that whole mantra that we've already heard. Clearly, the Democratic Party has a different idea. What is that idea? I mean, how are we, if everybody's not benefiting and this is not working, what are we going to do differently with a Democratic president in the White House that will, in fact, be better for everybody?
Well, I think the number one thing that Democrats are really focused on, and that was a big factor in winning the House back in 2018, was health care. Being able to make sure that people are able to pay for health insurance. A lot of the candidates have different proposals on that, whether it's a system like Joe Biden's proposing where there's subsidies and there's a public buy-in, or something like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren's proposing where it's Medicare for all. And there's not a whole lot from the Republican Party on where do we go with health care. They're still chipping away at Obamacare because it doesn't seem like they're going to be removing that like they've tried to.
So beyond healthcare, I mean, are there other things? I mean, this president seems to be, his direction seems to be on the economy, reducing regulation, pushing back on countries like China on trade, trying to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I'm not sitting here trying to catalog all of Donald Trump's proposals, but I think we've all seen what his proposals are. I mean, beyond healthcare, where's the Democratic Party go on those other things?
Well, I think there's such wealth disparity. That's been a big thing with corporations, with college, trying to raise the minimum wage. Who knows what that'll eventually turn into. I know all of them are proposing $15. We'll see if Congress goes along with that. But really being able to help people get to that next step. So if you talk about something with the economy, like taxes, where the Republican tax plan, it was very much top down, where the top 1% or whatever, all those Bernie Sanders statistics, where they can pay more to help the middle class and especially people who are really struggling.
Right.
Being able to afford college. I'm a college student myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thousands of dollars in debt. It's not fun. So being able to do things like that, getting better paying jobs, that's a big thing. Making sure that salaries continue to go up because they've started to trickle up a little bit, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hear you on student debt. I think I had 4 kids already by the time I paid off my student debt from college. That was actually my student debts just from law school because I went through college on a scholarship, and I got a daughter who's counsel for NYPD, and she's hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt from her law school. That's one of the biggest parts of her monthly budget, so I get it that that's a huge deal. I mean, so far we're trying to focus this on Pennsylvania, not exclusively. We're talking mostly sort of economic bread and butter issues, my terminology, not yours, kitchen table issues, that kind of thing. Do you see foreign policy and that kind of stuff being a big issue in this election, or not so much?
Yeah, I do actually. I think a lot of people want to see a bit more stability when it comes to foreign policy. You know, like with the Syria decision a couple weeks ago, that was kind of out of the blue. It surprised a lot of people. People want to see us really stand with our values. You know, when you talk about Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, but then try and get a deal done with North Korea, it sets a bad precedent because say he does get a deal done with North Korea, is the next president just going to pull away from that? When you talk about something like the Paris Climate Accord, where it's a non-binding agreement and we pulled out of it and we're the only country in the world, I believe, at this point, that's still out of it, it creates a lot of precedents where the next president could just pull out of those, whatever the previous president had done. You know, and I think we really need to reclaim our spot.
So do you see, I mean, I want to touch base here in a minute, actually, kind of coming around to impeachment and some of the accusations against Trump now, briefly at least. But before we get to that, you just mentioned the Paris Accords, climate change. Clearly, Donald Trump's attitude toward, I mean, he's all about fossil fuels. He's all about that kind of deal. Is climate change a big part of this election, in your view? Is it going to play, I mean, bring it back down to Pennsylvania. Is climate change, green energy, that kind of thing going to be a big factor in PA, in your view?
I believe it can be, especially with younger voters that are going to lean Democratic. Climate change is a much bigger issue than it would be for someone older. And I think it comes back to the economy. This is a new like industrial revolution, I would say, about being able to create clean energy jobs, such as windmills and solar and all that, that we're really going to be able to create a lot of jobs and be good for the economy.
Okay, so let's, as we're closing in toward the end here, I want to make sure to save time at the end for you to put out information for anybody that wants to get involved in the Democratic Party side here. But in the last few minutes that we've got, right now, as we're recording this, we have some sort of impeachment proceeding going on in the House. I say personally, I'm a little confused procedurally on exactly what has been voted for and what has not been voted for. But in any event, leaving aside that snarky comment, there is a lot of commentary about basically what I will brand as an accusation that the president is not acting presidential at a minimum. If he hasn't engaged in criminal activity, that he somehow at least brought disfavor on the office. Again, my phraseology, not yours. This ain't the guy that we want in the White House. He doesn't represent our country well, this general gist. And that is clear in regard to this impeachment thing. We don't want this guy in the Oval Office because we kind of feel like he's not representing us well on the world stage. That's probably a charitable way to put it. Is that a big factor in your view in Pennsylvania? I mean, are people really going to vote on the basis of that? Does that resonate with people in the state?
I think we have to see how it turns out. Because if it does end up being true, like these accusations that Donald Trump's trying to use his office and withholding aid to try and get information on a political candidate, I should say, try and get information on a political opponent, I think that sets just a terrible precedent. You know, what happens when the next Democratic president comes in? Are they going to do the same thing to Republicans? But I think Democrats also have to be careful because if they try and push something where they don't have enough evidence to push articles of impeachment on that, and they try to get something like the Republicans did with Bill Clinton, where it's like obstruction of justice and some other stuff that's not quite related, I think that could hurt them.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that because I think there is a point, and this is regardless of party, where people just sort of say, it's kind of like you walk into a room and two of your kids are in a fight and they're all pointing their finger at each other. And at some point I can tell you as a parent, you're sort of like, I don't care, and I'm not listening to either one of you. I'm just disgusted with both of you right now. You wonder when people start feeling that way about both major parties. And I would echo your sentiment that, you know, we need to remember, and this is for my Republican brethren as well, whatever the hell rules you set, those rules apply to everybody. You know, you think it's fun to tear down Bill Clinton. Well, once you set that set that precedent. You find out decades later you're being treated to the same tactics. And I wish we could get back to where we're solving these differences the way I think the Founding Fathers intended, which is at the ballot box.
I couldn't agree
in
more.
the voting booth, man. Stop criminalizing politics. If you don't like Donald Trump, then throw him out the old-fashioned way, get more votes. Okay, that's my little speech, but you get to give us whatever information you want to give us on how people contact the Democratic Party. They're up here in Northeast Pennsylvania, anywhere in PA. They want to get involved with the Democratic Party. How do they do that?
You can go on Facebook. We have my committee, where I'm on the Wayne County Democratic Committee. You can look us up on Facebook, message us on there. We'll be sure to get back to you. I know there's other counties that have it. Be sure to contact them. I'm sure you can look them up on Facebook, figure out information. We have a website as well, Wayne County PA Democrats. But yeah, definitely a lot of people need to get involved, even if they're a Republican. The more people involved, the better it is for our democracy and for our country.
Amen. If you're not happy, get involved. Don't sit on the sidelines and complain. And sure as hell, don't stay home and then complain what the result was on Election Day. Austen, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Ground Truth.